All right, so we're going to talk today about building codes. We talked about zoning on Monday, and zoning is, can I get someone to give me an overview of what zoning was that we talked about on Monday? Just turn your mic on and talk. I know some of the people are in the studio and can't. Put it in the chat. What were zoning codes?
Is it a set of rules that a municipality or city gives that people have to follow by for their buildings and other things?
Yeah, it talks about what's allowed to be built, where it can be built, how high it can be, but it doesn't talk anything about the actual building itself. It's really about the envelope, how big the envelope can be, where it can be, and then what kind of uses you can have in a community, right? So building codes are going to talk about how you're going to build specific structure and what you're going to do. Every community will have, most communities have zoning, almost all of them do, and everybody will have building codes, whether if it's not a local municipality, you may have a state code. So what we're going to do today is talk about building codes. Yeah. It's not liking my, there we go. So this is a building code from 1780 BC, discovered on a stone slab. Apparently you can see it in the Louvre. It says, I'm just going to read this. If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. If it kill the son of the owner, the son of that builder shall be put to death. If it kill a slave of the owner, then he shall pay slave for slave the owner of the house. If it ruins goods, he shall make compensation for all that had been ruined, inasmuch that he did not properly construct the house and it fell. He shall reconstruct or re-erect the house from his own means. He'll pay for it again. If a builder builds a house for someone, even though he has not yet completed it, if the walls seem to be toppling, the builder must make the walls solid from his own means. So this was one of the oldest building code that they found. Essentially, this was your liability. This was your insurance. You didn't want to have the house fall down because it could cause your death or the death of your son. Or notice there's no daughters in here, and you're responsible for the house. So they're saying, so this is the start of building codes. When a builder builds something, they need to make sure it works. So what are building codes? They're ordinances established either at the state level or local level, giving minimum requirements that must be met in construction and maintenance of a building. So once you've figured out the zoning, then you have to figure out the building codes. And each municipality will have slight variations on it, and a lot of the codes are based on where you are building. So there's ones that are specific to certain regions. So the history is that, oops, it jumped ahead of me. Computer's being funny today. So there've been building codes for centuries to ensure that when somebody builds a building, it's safe, sanitary for the people who are going to use it. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington encouraged the development of building codes. If you remember, George Washington was a surveyor, so he was involved in some of the construction, and Thomas Jefferson was an architect. So they encouraged the development of building codes. The codes we use today are a result of great fires that swept throughout the United States in the 1800s. Chicago Building Code was developed in 1875. It was developed because there was the big Chicago fire in 1871, and most of Chicago burned. Everybody knows that story. And it was not Mrs. O'Leary's cow, but insurance companies refused to insure any buildings unless they had minimum standard codes. And they also banned buildings of non-combustible materials. That's why all the old buildings in Chicago are brick, because they wanted fireproof buildings. So local jurisdictions mandate the building code. Federal government does not have anything to do with the building codes. We're going to get into some codes that the federal government does get involved in. So if you have any questions as we go through, just shout them out. So the Chicago Fire of 1871, this was devastating. Chicago was a booming town. I think at the time there were 300,000 inhabitants, which was big for in the 1870s. It was a booming town, and the fire devastated the community. There was another fire in Wisconsin that burned a town, and I can't remember the name of it offhand, to the ground on the same night, and more people died up there than in Chicago, even though it was a small town. But Chicago got all the recognition. And I'm just reading a book that my brother gave me on Michigan history and sites, and there was a town in Michigan that burned on the same night. And it was a small town. You don't hear about that either. They are thinking that it was meteor shower that caused these fires, and it wasn't Mrs. O'Leary's cow, but it pretty much decimated the entire city. And so when they were rebuilding, the insurance companies mandated that we're not going to insure this town unless we have buildings that are more fireproof. So in 1906, San Francisco had a major earthquake. This was pretty devastating, and because of this earthquake, they changed their building codes to become have the buildings have earthquake resistance. So this is one of the scenarios where you would have site specific. So if you're in an earthquake zone, you have to be certified to design for earthquake design, and buildings have to meet certain criteria. And in Japan, I think it was in 1985, there was a huge earthquake in Kobe, and a lot of people died. A lot of buildings were damaged. So the Japanese government mandated that all existing buildings be retrofitted to be hurricane resistant. There's no such thing as earthquake resistant. There's no such thing as earthquake proof. And that any new buildings meet much higher standards. So it was in 2011, no, I'm trying to figure out how old my son was. 2013 was when the big earthquake and tsunami happened in Japan. Remember, the tsunami was it's a result of the earthquake. You get these high tidal waves, and the 40-foot high waves went over their tsunami walls, and thousands of people died. My son was living in Japan at that time, and very few buildings collapsed, even though that was a very extreme earthquake, much bigger than anything we've ever seen in this country, because they had adapted all their buildings to work for that, to be earthquake resistant. He said when the earthquake happened, he was in his shop, he was doing research, and he said, I asked him what it felt like, and he said it was like riding the Green Line. So, the building's swaying. So if you can imagine your whole building swaying like the train coming downtown, and then all the emergency doors shut. And he said very little damage in Tokyo. There was, some cracked walls, but no buildings fell down. I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to show you a video about the San Francisco earthquake.
There's something interesting that caught our eye. In 1906, a massive earthquake and out-of-control fire devastated San Francisco. In 2017, a century-old film turned up at a California flea market. After seeing the discovery on Facebook, photo historian Jason Wright bought the film on a hunch that it might be long-lost footage of a crippled San Francisco shot 2 weeks after the quake. We recently spoke to Wright from his home in High Burton, England, about the secrets revealed in the now restored film.
In April 1906, a major earthquake struck San Francisco. The quake was very large in itself, but most of the damage was actually caused by fire, which ripped through the city. Whole swathes of San Francisco were completely leveled and destroyed. We've known about this film for over 100 years, but it's more of a rediscovery. It's been lost all this time. What it actually is about 1 to 2 weeks after the earthquake actually hit. It's basically a trip down Market Street done by the Miles brothers, and there's a famous tape that most people have already seen, which went down Market Street just a couple days before the earthquake hit. The previous footage of the trip down Market Street only survives because one of the Miles brothers actually sent that footage over to their New York studio literally 1 day before the earthquake hit. This is a missing film of their trip back down Market Street once the earthquake had already happened. So it allows us to really compare and contrast basically before and after and see the devastation that actually had gone on. All the hustle and bustle that you saw on the previous trip down Market Street, that's all kind of gone, and people are quite kind of down and kind of shuffling around, all the pomp and all the rich people going past in their expensive cars. That's completely gone now. As you move down Market Street, you see most of the buildings are gone at this point. You see a lot of ancient steam engines. They used to put chains around the buildings and pull the buildings down using the steam engine. As you get down towards the bottom of Market Street, though, you get to the ferry building, and this is the most important part of the film for me. You see the human cost of the actual tragedy. You see a lot of people basically in line, from rich to poor, everybody, and they're waiting for ferries and boats to take them out of the disaster area. And then towards the end of the movie, it flicks through a few more scenes. You see dynamiting taking place, City Hall being blown up, for example, which is a bit disconcerting, and then the demolition of Prager's department store. I wanted to bring this to the people of San Francisco. I wanted to make sure we conserved it for future generations because I think it's very important. With this film, you see the human element of what happened. Disaster strikes and everybody's lives are changed. And it just makes us realize, I think, how quickly things can go to pieces. But it also shows us how people can dust themselves off and basically get back to life and rebuild again. You just can't keep down San Francisco. San Franciscans, they just keep on going.
Remarkable. That video from 1906.
So what we're going to talk about is most building codes result of some kind of tragedy or accident that happened. So after the San Francisco earthquake, they then instituted major building code laws so that they could protect the buildings better. And you heard that most of the damage came from fire because when the buildings fell down, I'm not sure how many gas lines there were, but there were other things. So the fires were the bigger cause of that buildings there. Let me show you another video about the Mexico earthquake that occurred in 2017.
Este edificio se movió horrible, horrible, tronó horrible. Que se salgan, la pared se rompió, que se salgan. Que se salgan, se va a caer, se va a caer. Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío. La gente. Exacto, güey. Sí. Y ahorita ni siquiera se escucha. ¡Pásalo, perro! ¡Bravo!
Look at that building swaying.
¿Qué pedo? Pues sí está muy cabrón. Mírame la cantidad de edificios que se cayeron. No lo puedo creer.
No, impresionante.
Pues yo vi uno cayéndose aquí, güey, ahí al ladito. No puede ser.
Se cayeron edificios. Se cayeron.
Sí, todavía. Con réplica. Sí.
So you can tell some of the new buildings in Mexico, while they swayed, they did just fine because they did what they're supposed to do. They reacted to being with in the to be able to handle the aftershock and the quake. Where some of the older buildings were probably designed either before they had earthquake building codes, or they were not properly designed for whatever reason. So the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is kind of important. So what they're saying is if there's not power designated in the Constitution, it's up to the states. And that's where we get into building codes are regulated by the states. So there's exceptions to state and local codes. And the first one is manufactured housing. And that's because you can have a house that's manufactured in Iowa and shipped to Kentucky. And it may meet Iowa codes, but not Kentucky codes, et cetera. So that's interstate commerce. So the federal government's going to mandate the codes at that level. The next one is the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And that applies to all public housing and projects in all states. ADA also applies within a state to any building that's open to the public. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that guarantees that people who have either mobility issues, sight issues, hearing issues, a whole number of things, can get in and use public spaces. OSHA is a federal requirements, Occupational Safety and Health Association. Is anybody taking OSHA right now with Jose? So if you're in one of the certificates, you need to take OSHA, or if you're in construction technology, you should take OSHA. So that talks about worker safety, and that those also came from tragedies. And then federal funding is tied to the level of building codes adopted. So those are the exceptions to the state and local codes, but the codes are mandated by the state and the local level. So state level codes, you can have state adoption where all buildings in a particular state are required to adhere to the same code that is adopted at the state level. And then you would have local amendments. So River Grove could have a different amendment than Maywood if they all adopted the same state code. But they can't be less stringent than the state code. So if the state code mandates a certain door width, you can't mandate something that's narrower, you can mandate something wider. Number of exits. You can't mandate less than the state would have. You can mandate more. So the local level has the ability to make the codes more stringent. And home rule allows adoption to local municipalities. That can vary widely. And those standards are set up to comply with state-run or state holdings. Next, the state variations are local codes address local issues. We already talked about this. Earthquakes, California is an earthquake zone, as we all know. Florida has hurricanes. They have one, and Louisiana too. Louisiana's getting ready to be hit today or tomorrow by its third third hurricane of the season. So they have special issues for hurricanes, so that the roofs are tied down better on the buildings. The windows are secured better. So there's different requirements for hurricanes than there are for earthquakes, neither of which we would have in Illinois. So that's where the local adaptations come in. So a building code's not just one document, it's usually a series of documents. And we're gonna look at these in a little bit, but it's not only the physical structure of the building, there's codes for gas, electrical, mechanical, fire alarm systems, plumbing, the ADA that we already talked about. So it's the entire building, but there's gonna be different sets of regulations. And building codes generally require all aspects of a construction project. They regulate all aspects from the structural design, environmental control, fire prevention. It can be materials, it can be energy conservation measures too. So it's pretty broad. So the minimum requirements for a building ensure health, safety, and general welfare, both for the workers and for people who are going to come into the building at any particular time. It doesn't guarantee that you get a good building. It just guarantees that you get a safe building. It doesn't guarantee that the building's not ugly. It just guarantees that it's safe. And just building to the code may not be enough. That's the bare minimum. You should always build the best that you can build in any particular situation. So here's what happens when codes are not followed. So here's one where the whole bottom is sinking because the codes were not followed. It's usually pretty disastrous effects. This particular one is in China. So they were building these series of high rises, and they were building one behind this one, I think it was, and they undermined the foundation. That means they dug too deep and the foundation wasn't holding up. But if I had a blow up, which I don't have, I should get it. These are the major structural columns. They're hollow. There's no steel in them. So I'd be really nervous if I had bought an apartment in one of these buildings and this thing came toppling down and I saw how the apartments were actually constructed. This is because somebody wasn't following the building codes. So codes can be there, and if somebody doesn't follow them or the inspector doesn't make sure they're followed, it doesn't do a lot of good. This is another picture of the Chinese office apartment building that fell over. Luckily, it didn't fall onto this building right here. That was it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Here's a deck that somebody built. They didn't follow codes, and it eventually collapsed. This one looks like it's starting to rot a little bit too, but my neighbor was building a deck and they had gotten no permit. They weren't following codes. It was just going to be awful. So they got cited by the village and they had to take it down. So if you don't follow building codes, you build something, you may very well have to take it down. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, and I think this was a video, and I don't have the video up, so I'm gonna slow by this one. And let's see I'll come back to that video later. So when do buildings apply? They apply when you're doing new construction. The entire building in a building of new construction must be in full compliance with all, not only zoning, but all local codes and ordinances. They apply when you're doing a renovation or an addition or alterations. When additions are added, the entire addition must meet current codes. Unaltered spaces, so like if you have a house and you're building a family room onto the back, they're not going to make you make the living room at the front comply with current codes, but they are going to make anything that you touch in the back, anything that you alter, so like if you renovated the kitchen, that's going to have to come up to code. If you added a building onto the back, that's going to have to come up to code. One exception that they'll make you go back is electrical. They'll make you add smoke detectors if you don't have them when you do any renovation. And when you open up the wall, if there's an electrical feed, you have to chase that feed to, if it goes upstairs or downstairs or into another room, and update that appropriately. Especially if it's, you want to do that is if it's knob and tube or cloth wire. Codes will, if you change the type of occupancy, not the person selling the house, but if you change the type of occupancy, like if we made this building at Triton School into a retail center, then codes are going to apply and we'd have to bring the building up to code. Sometimes the sale of a building may trigger upgrades, and that's really depends on the local jurisdiction. So they might make you add a sprinkler system, or smoke detectors is the big one. So anytime you're doing major work, you've got to watch what's happening. So we're going to talk about model codes. So a model code is a building code that's developed by an organization independent of the local jurisdictions, and the local jurisdiction can adopt or choose to accept that model code as their own. It used to be that every local jurisdiction had their own codes, and some were really good and some were not so good. And a lot of people didn't have the expertise to do this. So these model building codes were adopted and used by the jurisdictions. Then they would add their own local amendments to it. So most towns don't write their own. They usually adopt one of the building codes. And the current ones are the international building codes. And we're going to talk about those in a second. But there's the International Building Code that's for multifamily buildings or commercial buildings. International Residence Code is for 1 and 2 family residences. Some people use older codes, model codes that were BOCA, ICBO, and SBCCI. They were all consolidated into these International Building Code and International Residence Code. I have copies of all these codes here in the studio. So if you come by, I'd like to show them to you. We were meeting together as a class, we go through them. So these codes are referred to as model building codes because the towns model their building code after one of these. They adopt these. Almost everybody has switched to IBC or IRC, and they're reissued every 3 years. That doesn't mean each municipality gets to the current code, because that also requires a lot of work to change their amendments. So oftentimes they maybe do it every other issue. So what are model codes? What are the characteristics of model codes? They're well established in their scope, unambiguous language. So there's going to be a lot of definitions at the front and written in a way that inspectors can read and enforce. You don't want somebody skirting around the code. And then there's specific enforceable requirements. And as I said, the terms are clearly defined, similar to what we saw in the zoning codes. And it avoids permissive language. Permissive means you may do this, and it uses language such as you shall or you must, to not give any ambiguity about whether you should do it or not. And again, they're updated on a regular basis. So model codes have no force of law until they're adopted by a jurisdiction. Until River Grove adopts a model code, the model code has no impact on their community. So the local jurisdictions still have approval over what codes are adopted and what amendments they put into there. So amendments can be specific local conditions. We already talked about hurricanes and earthquakes. It can be local building practices. So like adobe construction could be allowed in the Southwest. It would not be allowed here in Chicago because it wouldn't hold up with the weather. It can address using local materials. It can address labor rules and requirements. And Of course, politics plays into all of this. So here's the International Building Code. Here's a cover of the front of the 2015 one. It's the model code. It was first published in 2000. That's when all of these codes consolidated. These three: Uniform Building Code, National Building Code, and Standard Building Code. The National Building Code was the one used in this area for the most part. And it had, they consolidated all of these so that there's continuity throughout the country. The base for building codes, as we said, is health and safety and protection of property, both your property and your neighbor's property. So the other book is the IRC, the International Residence Code. And this is for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhomes, not more than 3 stories in height. So if you go more than 3 stories in height, you're shifted over to the International Building Code, which may have more stringent requirements. And then again, local jurisdictions will have amendments to those codes. And designers and architects and builders are responsible to make sure that all codes and addendum are applied for whatever area they're building in. So here is the cover of the International, this is the International Code Council, and so this is for the International Residence Code for 1 and 2 family residences. You can see all the different chapters. There's wall coverings, roofs assembly. On the first page, there was, again, definition, scope, but building planning, foundations, floors, wall construction. So every section is separate. So if you're building a new building, you want to figure out what kind of chimney can I put in and how do I do it, you go to chapter 10 and you'd read that. Now there are people who are specific, this goes on and on. You're going to see a few pages of this. We go swimming pools, codes for swimming pools. And then there's all these appendices. And there are people whose total job specification is writing and reviewing codes. So there's code and spec writers who, code analysis people within a firm. They often are the same people who write the specs because they kind of go hand in hand. The specs have to meet the codes. And there are people who just specialize in this. And then, of course, there's the building inspectors who have to know all these codes, both when they review the drawings and when they come out to the site to do site inspections. So there'll be lots of tables in the codes. It'll tell you if you've got a 2x4, you can have a stud that's 10 feet high, 24 inches on center. If you're not supporting only the roof, if you're supporting a second floor, you have to be 16 inches on. So all of this stuff is very detailed and laid out in the code books. You can find a lot of these code books, maybe an older version if you Google IRC, International Residence Code, because some municipalities post them on their planning sites. So again, we have this whole family of I-codes. We had the International Residence Code, the International Building Code for the construction of the building. Then we get into Fire Code, International Fire Code, International Energy Code, International Plumbing Code, International Mechanical Code, International Fuel Gas. So they're all done by the same organization, but there's a separate book for each one. So we've got about 6-8 books here in the studio, with all the different codes in it. So here's the International Building Code. Remember, that's the bigger buildings or larger than 2-flat or a 3-story residence. And here's all the ones that are solid, are administered statewide. So the state has mandated those as a minimum. You can go better than that. And then the ones that are hatched, like Nevada, are local jurisdictions. But most people have adopted the IRC and the IBC. Here's for the residential code. Wisconsin's an outlier here. I'm not quite sure why. Illinois is local jurisdictions adapted. Again, California and Nevada, it's the whole state, all of the western states. In fact, for the building codes, most of the states have just statewide adoption. So local adoption of the IA codes. Oak Park uses the International Building Code, Energy Code, Fire Code, Fuel Gas Code, Plumbing Code, and we're going to go back to Oak Park again and look at their code requirements. When you are applying for a permit, you have to list on the drawing all the applicable building codes that you are meeting. They're going to review your drawings and they're going to tell you that this particular door doesn't meet the egress, meaning ability to get out requirements, and they'll list the specific code that they're referring to. Then you have to redraw your drawings with the changes so that it meets it. But you have to print this on the front of your set of drawings that you're meeting all of these codes. Obviously, if you're doing residence, you wouldn't be meeting International Building Code, you'd be meeting the International Residence Code and vice versa. And then also, Oak Park also adopts the following codes. They have a statewide plumbing code and Illinois Accessibility Code, which is different than the ADA. The American with Disabilities Act, which is a federal code, and that does not apply to your own house. It applies to anything where people would be coming in. So a restaurant, a store, a school, a hospital, things like that. Fair Housing Act and Illinois Energy Conservation Code. City of Chicago has its own code. They are phasing this out. We have one here is a big black book. Theirs is not, in some ways, it's more stringent than the International Building Code, but in a lot it's not. They will be adopting, and it was supposed to roll out past years, was my understanding, and it's been pushed aside for the time being, but they will be adopting the international, the I codes. They're one of the last holdouts. So the American with Disabilities Act was adopted in 1990. That's federal civil rights legislation. Somebody sued to get through enforcement of ability to access buildings to all citizens. And then it's mandated for new construction, again, not for residential, and renovations of a certain dollar amount. So it's usually a certain percentage of the building cost. So if Brighton were renovating the G building and it hit a certain cost of the hit a certain renovation level, they would have to bring this totally up to code. So there's certain ways that this doesn't meet code. I think some of the doors you come in are a full 3 feet wide. There's no bathroom on the third floor. You know, there's all kinds of issues. At least they have elevators. When I first started here, not every building had an elevator, so some of the classes on the third floor were not accessible, but they have fixed that. So certain dollar amounts will trigger you to comply with the American with Disabilities Act. Other codes are the National Fire Protection Association Code. This just ensures life safety. A lot of it's related to industry, so specialized fire safety. You're going to have national electric codes. We have our renewable energy class, and they are going to be studying the National Electrical Code next semester in renewable energy. So that's a big thing. We have energy standards. ASHRAE 90. ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And they were one of the first to develop an energy standard. It's been watered down because developers got on these boards and changed it because they didn't like to have energy standards, which is how they have these. So they'll have minimum insulation levels in the wall, but they won't have maximum glazing or glass in the space. So they're kind of defunct. The IECC is the International Energy Conservation Code. So this is, again, about building energy conservation. People are always trying to skirt around these. Although more companies are doing energy conservation because it saves them the bottom line. If they reduce their operating costs, then they save money. So if you're in Dan's class, you'll hear more about this if you're in Sustainability 1, but energy codes are determined by the climate zone that you live in. So you can see here, we're in climate zone 5. Southern Illinois is in climate zone 4. And northern Minnesota is in climate zone 7. So zone 7 is going to want a lot more insulation. They're going to have more stringent codes because of the severe cold. Down here, they're going to have different types of codes because of the intense heat. So you have to look at where you're living too to understand how the different codes apply to you. And then I'm just going to touch on this briefly because you'll get this in sustainability, but here's those climate zones 1 through 7 that we saw. And U factor is insulation. So let's go to wall and floor. If you could, but we'll do ceiling, that's easiest. So climate zone 1 was the southern tip of Florida. Their ceiling R value only has to be 30. So R is the resistance to transmission. So your insulation comes in different R values. That pink insulation that you often put in walls on new construction. And the ceiling is where they found that they need the most insulation. So you notice that the floor is less numbers and the wall is less numbers because most heat higher rises. So they want to stop it from going out the ceiling. So you notice this number is going up. We start at 30 in southern Florida. By the time we get up to northern Minnesota, we're at 49 R value, which is depending on the type of insulation you do, but it's several inches, if not over a foot of insulation. So you need to understand that too when you're designing a building, because the wall and the roof and the floor have to be able to accommodate. And then the other thing that we do is fenestration or windows. Those are dependent on the space too. Again, Florida is least restrictive because we don't have those cold winters. And we have the lower number, which is, this is the R value. Lower is worse. Lower is better in the R value, and in the U value, higher is better. So we're higher is better here. So when you go to get a building permit, and this is pulled from the Village of Oak Park, they're responsible for making sure that all the structures used in Oak Park are constructed and improved and preserved with regard to life of property and life safety. And they will review your drawings and then issue you a permit, and then they also will come out and inspect your building as it's under construction. So here's permission to work. You'll get a permit. You have to display it prominently in your window. I think this is when we did our garage. You have to display it prominently in your window. So if somebody's driving by and they see something that looks like somebody's doing work, they're looking first for this permit. Nowadays they have a computer and they just type it into the computer to make sure that the people have pulled a permit. If they haven't, they can make you take down everything that you did, and they will. So enforcement of codes is at the local level again, and then we have code enforcement officials. They have formal training and certification. So you have the plan review to review the drawings that you submit to the village. And then we have subspecialties, so zoning, which we talked about earlier. We might have building, plumbing, fire. Depending on a bigger building, they're going to ship these out. Most plan examiners are now contract employees. It used to always be at the local village level, but now you submit them online. You never talk to anybody. It's all done via the internet. And then building inspectors are at the local level. They visit the site, and they will also have subspecialties. You'll have a plumbing inspector. You'll have a mechanical inspector. And then the other thing that in a community, all the contractors have to be certified within the village. So the permit process is you apply for the permit, do a plan review, send you back the drawings, you redo them, review it again, and they issue you a permit. So I should add a couple of back and forths in here. Then you start construction, they do inspections, and the last thing is certification of occupancy. So they come out at the end and make sure that you finished everything off right, that there's switch plate covers on everything, the door hardware is correct, and then they'll let you move into your space. So the International Code Council, if you're interested in, this is where you can find this, and you can also find the IRC, the IBC. International Code Council is, again, the group that maintains these code books. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to Oak Park. And we go to Village of Oak Park again. Here I had it up before. So the permits processing division comes up again that we saw before. Remember last time we were in zoning, and here we're in permits. So when you're under here, it'll list all the applicable building codes. So here's all those codes that I had printed out. And that we'll talk about ADA compliance, Americans with Disability Act. It'll tell you what kind of insurance contractors have to have, how you get a construction permit, and what you need a construction permit for, almost everything. It'll go through the fees are on a separate website, and then how you do inspections and how you do plan reviews. You even have to have a permit. Most communities do for signs so that you don't have obnoxious signs up, and that will go over to zoning to make sure that they work. So this is where you would come first. They have a portal that does everything online. You submit the permits online. Let's see what the forms are here. If they come up on yeah, they do. So here's all the forms that you would have under permitting. Here's permit application. So again, this is all done online. I think I just lost you on the thing. The permit application pulled up separate. So that's, in a nutshell, what codes are. People spend their whole lives just doing codes. If you're like that kind of thing, you'll be very popular with the architecture offices. Big offices will have somebody in there that just does codes. So you can come up with the fanciest design you want, but if it doesn't meet code, you can't get it built. And codes, unlike zoning, with zoning, you can go for a zoning variance saying, I don't want to do this. Codes, you're not going to be able to do that. So are there any questions about this?